The rancher lived 10 winters alone. Until a Diné woman knocked on his door, James had lived on the plains for as long as he could remember. The ranch stretched for miles, a wide expanse of rolling fields, old wooden fences, and dusty paths that led to the hills in the distance. He had chosen this life carefully, a life away from towns, away from crowds, away from people who never seemed to understand him. For 10 winters, he had lived alone. 10 winters where the snow fell thick and silent, where the winds howled through the gaps in the windows and the fire in the old stove was the only warmth in the house. Each morning, James woke before the sun. The sky was often gray and heavy with snow in winter, but he liked those quiet mornings when the world was still. He would put on his thick coat and worn boots, grab the feed for the animals, and begin his day. The horses were always waiting in the barn, their breath fogging in the cold air, their eyes curious but calm. The cows wandered slowly, their heads down, crunching through the frozen grass, and the chickens huddled in their coop. James fed each one, talking quietly as he worked, though no one ever answered. His days were filled with routines that might have seemed boring to an outsider, but to James they were a kind of rhythm, a comfort he could rely on. He repaired fences that the wind had knocked down, chopped firewood to keep the house warm, and fixed tools that broke under the strain of hard work. The house itself was old, with creaking floors and a roof that sometimes let snow in during the harshest storms. But it was his home. Every nail, every board, every scratch on the floor told a story of the years he had spent here, alone but steady. Evenings were the hardest. After the chores were done and the animals fed, James would sit by the fire, staring into the flames. The quiet of the plains was beautiful, yes, but it was also deep and heavy. Memories would come uninvited, of friends he had left behind, of laughter that seemed to belong to another life, of family that he no longer spoke to. He would stare at the walls, lined with old photographs and tools, wishing sometimes for someone to break the silence. But then he would shake his head, reminding himself why he had chosen this life: freedom, independence, peace. James had learned to appreciate small joys: a warm cup of coffee in the morning, the sight of a hawk soaring above the hills, the first green sprout in his garden in spring, or the smell of wood smoke drifting through the house. He read the weather in the sky, understood the movements of his animals, and could predict the coming of storms better than any forecast. Nature was his companion. The wind whispered, the rain tapped, and the snow blanketed the world in quiet beauty. It was a language he had grown to understand, even love. Yet, as content as he appeared, loneliness lingered. The first winters were easier. He had come from a busy life in a small town where the streets were crowded and noise was constant. The quiet had been a relief. But over the years, the isolation began to press on him. He would sometimes leave the house to drive to the distant town just to hear voices that didn't belong to animals or the wind. The neighbors were polite but few, and most left him to his own life. James realized that humans were part of the world, like the trees and animals, but his part of the world was one of solitude. In the depth of winter, the nights were long. He would sit by the fire after supper, sometimes playing a tune on his old guitar, strings worn but sounding true. He thought of the life he could have had elsewhere: a warm house with laughter, children running in the yard, friends visiting on Sundays. But then he would glance outside, at the wide fields stretching endlessly, the snow sparkling under the moonlight, and he would smile faintly. There was a freedom here that towns could never give, a connection to the earth, a life that belonged entirely to him. Even in his loneliness, James had routines that filled his time. He wrote letters he never sent, notes about the animals, observations about the weather, and small thoughts about life. He kept a journal of the seasons, of planting and harvest, of births and losses among his animals. It was his way of talking to the world, even when the world did not answer. On some days he would walk along the hills looking at the horizon, imagining the places beyond the plains. On others he would simply sit on the porch, listening to the wind and watching the snow settle in delicate patterns. He also found a quiet joy in fixing things: a broken fence post, a leaky roof, a stubborn horse. It was all a puzzle he could solve. Each solved problem was a small victory, a reminder that he could take care of himself. He had built this life with his own hands, from dawn to dusk, winter after winter, and that gave him a sense of pride. But pride, he knew, could not replace companionship. It could not warm the house on the coldest nights, or make the long silence feel less heavy. Despite this, James rarely admitted to feeling lonely. He told himself he was content, that the solitude was a gift. He had his routines, his animals, his land, and the quiet majesty of the plains. He had learned to survive and even thrive on his own. And yet, deep inside, there was a small part of him that wondered if life could offer more, if someone could walk through the snow and bring warmth to the long winters he had spent alone. It was on a particularly cold afternoon, with snow drifting in from the north and the wind cutting across the plains, that James felt the first stirring of change. He had returned from feeding the cattle, the barn door shutting with a dull thud behind him. He stoked the fire, prepared a simple meal, and settled into his chair. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in white, and he listened to the silence. He did not yet know that this silence would soon be broken, that a new chapter in his life was about to begin, one that would bring stories, laughter, and companionship he had not felt in 10 long winters. For now, though, he simply sat, watching the fire, the snow, and the endless horizon. He was a man of the plains, of cold mornings and quiet nights, of routines and self-reliance, and he was alone, as he had chosen. But the world, he did not yet realize, had a way of surprising even those who thought they were ready for nothing new. The late afternoon light had already begun to fade, casting long shadows across the snow-covered plains. James was in his small kitchen, stirring a pot of stew he had made from dried beans and the last of the winter vegetables. The fire in the stove crackled, sending a warm glow across the room. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, rattling the roof and whipping the snow into small drifts around the porch. James loved the winter for its quiet beauty, but on nights like this, the cold made the world feel even lonelier. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it echoed through the old house as if demanding attention. James froze, his spoon hovering over the pot. He was not used to visitors. In the 10 winters he had lived alone, only the postman, once a week, had come near the house. And now, a knock, at this hour? His first instinct was caution. He wiped his hands on his coat, moved quietly toward the door, and peeked through the small window. Standing in the snow was a young woman. Her face was partially hidden by a colorful shawl that wrapped her head and shoulders, but her eyes were visible, bright, and alert. She seemed small against the vastness of the snow-covered land, yet there was a calmness in her presence. She lifted a gloved hand in greeting. "Hello!" she called softly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my car broke down a few miles back, and I didn't know where else to go." James hesitated. He had always been wary of strangers. The plains were beautiful, but they could be dangerous. And yet, something in the woman's voice, the calm, polite tone, the careful way she spoke, stirred a memory of kindness he had not felt in years. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The cold rushed in immediately, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and pine. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "It's cold out there." She nodded, stepping over the threshold. Her boots were dusted with snow, and her gloves were wet, but she moved with ease, as if she had walked many miles before. James closed the door behind her and gestured toward the fire. "You can warm up here. I'll see about your car later." She smiled, a small, grateful smile that lit her face. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was gentle yet confident. She removed her shawl, revealing thick dark hair that fell loosely over her shoulders. Her features were strong yet soft, and James noticed the calmness in her movements. She seemed comfortable in the quiet, as if she belonged in this wide, empty world just as much as he did. James returned to his stew, stirring it slowly as he watched her settle into a chair near the fire. She had a small bag with her, which she set carefully on the floor. "I'm Leona," she said, noticing his gaze. "I was on my way home when my car stopped working. I didn't want to spend the night out there in the snow." "James," he replied. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The words felt strange to say. He had lived alone for so long that sharing space felt unusual. but at the same time there was a warmth in offering help, a connection that had been missing from his life for too long.
Leona nodded and smiled again, this time more openly.
"I really appreciate it," she said.
"It's nice to meet someone out here. I wasn't sure if I'd find anyone from Miles."
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and James felt a sudden sense of relief. The house no longer felt empty, even though there was only one visitor. Over the next hour, they talked quietly while the stew simmered. James learned that Leona was a teacher, working with children on the Navajo Nation. She spoke about her family, the traditions she tried to preserve, and the love she had for the land she had grown up on. James listened carefully, intrigued by her stories. He had never met anyone quite like her, someone who seemed so rooted in her culture yet so open to the world around her. In turn, he shared tales of the ranch, of his years alone, and of the routines that filled his days. He talked about the animals, the long winters, and the satisfaction of building a life from scratch. Leona listened with interest, asking questions and offering thoughtful responses. She had a way of listening that made James feel heard, as if the words he spoke were not just filling the air but carrying meaning to someone else. When the stew was ready, they sat at the small wooden table eating in companionable silence. The food was simple, but the warmth of the fire and the presence of another human being made it taste richer than anything he had eaten in months. James noticed how her eyes brightened when she spoke, how her hands moved gracefully as she ate. For the first time in years, he realized that companionship could make even the most ordinary moments feel extraordinary. After dinner, the snow outside grew heavier, falling in thick, soft flakes that blanketed the plains in white. Leona offered to help clean up, and James found himself grateful for the company. Together, they washed the dishes, dried them, and stacked them carefully. There was an ease in their movements, a rhythm that felt natural, despite having just met. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was comfortable, filled with the simple presence of another person.
As the evening wore on, James showed her to a spare room.
It was small, with a single bed and a thin blanket, but it was warm and dry. "It's not much," he said, "but it will keep you comfortable tonight." Leona smiled, laying her bag down. "It's perfect," she replied. "Thank you, James. I promise I won't be any trouble." Once she was settled, James returned to his chair by the fire.
He stared into the flames, thinking about how strange the day had turned out to be. A simple knock on the door had changed the quiet of his life, if only for one evening. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation, curiosity, perhaps even hope. The plains were still cold, still vast, but the house felt different now, warmer, fuller, alive. That night, as the wind howled and snow piled higher outside, James found himself listening to more than just the storm. He could hear Leona moving in the other room, preparing for sleep, and it was a comforting sound. He realized that for 10 winters he had been alone by choice, yet he had never considered how much a single presence could change everything. Sleep came slowly, but it came. James drifted off with the quiet realization that life could be unpredictable, that even the most remote and solitary existence could be interrupted by something or someone extraordinary. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, covering the land in white. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of a visitor made the house feel like a true home, if only for the night. In the days that followed, Leona stayed longer than one night. Her car could not be fixed immediately, and she offered to help with chores on the ranch. James accepted, unsure why he felt relief at her presence, but certain that the days were suddenly brighter. Together they worked to repair fences, feed the animals, and clear snow from the paths. The hard work was easier with 2 people, and the house, once silent, was now filled with conversation and laughter. James began to notice small things he had long forgotten. The way someone could appreciate the land alongside him, how a shared task could feel lighter, and how stories exchanged could bring comfort and understanding. He felt a connection to Leona that he could not explain, a bond built on shared effort, mutual respect, and the quiet rhythm of daily life. For the first time in 10 winters, James felt a sense of belonging beyond his own routines. The house no longer seemed so lonely, the plains no longer so empty, and the nights no longer so long. He did not yet know where this connection would lead, but he felt a spark of possibility, a reminder that life could still surprise him, even in the middle of a long, cold winter. And so, with the fire crackling and the snow falling outside, James and Leona continued to share stories, tasks, and quiet moments. The world beyond the plains seemed distant and unimportant. In the small, warm house, two strangers had become companions, and in that companionship a change had begun, one that neither of them could have predicted, but both would come to treasure. Days turned into weeks, and the winter on the plains seemed to stretch endlessly. Yet inside James's old ranch house, life felt warmer and fuller than it had in years. Leona had stayed longer than anyone could have expected. Her car, damaged from the icy roads, could not be fixed quickly, and she had offered to help James with the daily chores of ranch life. He had accepted without hesitation, though a small part of him wondered why he felt such relief at her presence.
For the first time in a decade, his days no longer passed in quiet solitude. Every morning, the routine remained the same: feed the animals, check fences, and prepare firewood.
But now, tasks that once felt heavy and lonely were lighter with two people sharing the work. Leona had a natural way with the animals. The horses, who had once been wary of strangers, followed her calmly as she brushed them and fed them oats. The cows, too, seemed to recognize her kindness, moving easily into the barn when she called. James watched her, amazed at how quickly she adapted to life on the ranch, and felt a growing admiration for her skills, patience, and gentle strength. After chores, they would retreat to the warmth of the kitchen. Leona would help him prepare meals, her hands moving efficiently as she chopped vegetables or stirred the stew. During these quiet moments, they shared stories and memories, laughing at small mistakes or recalling childhood adventures. Leona spoke of growing up on the Navajo Nation, of her family, and the traditions she had been taught. She described the sacred stories, the lessons of the land, and the importance of keeping the culture alive. James listened intently, fascinated by a world so different from his own, yet filled with wisdom and beauty. In return, he told her about the plains, the long winters, and the animals he had cared for all these years. He described the joy of planting a garden in spring, the thrill of a newborn calf, and the quiet satisfaction of repairing fences in the fading sunlight. Leona would ask questions, genuinely curious, and James realized that he had forgotten how it felt to explain things to someone who truly wanted to understand. Her attention made him feel valued, as if the stories he had thought unimportant were actually worth sharing. Their days were long, filled with labor and learning, but the hours passed quickly. Leona taught James small things too. She showed him new ways to feed the chickens to reduce stress, suggested repairs for the barn doors that would make them last longer, and even helped him organize a small library of books and journals. James, in turn, taught her to ride the horses properly, to recognize the subtle signs of animal behavior, and to read the weather in the changing clouds. Each lesson, each shared moment built trust and a sense of partnership between them. Sometimes when the snow fell thickly, they would sit by the window looking out over the frozen fields. The silence of the plains, which had once felt oppressive to James, now seemed beautiful and full of life. They would watch a fox slipping through the snow, a hawk circling high above, or the subtle tracks left by deer. Leona often spoke softly in these moments, reflecting on the world outside, while James listened and added his own thoughts. There was a rhythm to these times, a shared understanding that did not require words but created a bond deeper than conversation. Evenings became a favorite time for both of them. After the animals were fed and chores completed, they would sit by the fire, warming their hands and sharing quiet stories. Leona sometimes played a small tune on her harmonica, and James, remembering his old guitar, would join in. Music filled the house in a way that had not been heard for 10 winters, turning the old walls into a space of warmth and comfort. They laughed when notes went wrong, teased each other gently, and found joy in these simple pleasures. James began to notice how Leona's presence changed the feel of the house. The old wooden floors, once creaking under the weight of emptiness, now carried the soft rhythm of two people living and working together. Meals were shared, chores were lighter, and conversation filled the spaces that had been silent for so long. James felt a sense of companionship that he had not realized he had missed. It was not just her work or her stories. It was the way she listened, the way she respected the land, and the warmth she brought into his life without trying. Their bond grew naturally, like the slow thawing of ice in spring. They shared small victories, a fence repaired, a calf safely delivered, a stove fixed before a winter storm. They also shared small frustrations, stubborn animals, frozen pipes, and long hours in the cold. But even the difficult moments seemed easier because they faced them together. Leona had a way of bringing lightness to the heaviest tasks, often laughing at minor mishaps which made James smile more than he had in years. One afternoon, Leona asked about his family, and James hesitated. He rarely spoke of them. His choice to live alone had come from years of disappointment and loss, of relationships that had frayed and disappeared. But looking at Leona, he felt a trust he had not felt in a long time. Slowly he spoke of his childhood, his siblings, and the reasons he had chosen the plains over towns and cities. Leona listened without judgment, offering quiet empathy and understanding. Her presence made it easier to face memories he had long kept hidden, and he realized how much healing could come from sharing his story. Leona, too, shared her fears and dreams. She spoke of wanting to make a difference in the lives of the children she taught, of preserving her culture, and of learning as much as possible about the world beyond her home. James admired her courage and determination. He realized that while he had chosen solitude, she had chosen connection, and somehow, their paths crossing had created a bridge between these two ways of living.
As winter continued, the snow grew deeper and the days shorter.
Yet inside the house there was warmth, laughter, and shared purpose. James began to feel hope, a feeling he had thought was long gone. He looked at Leona and noticed the subtle ways she had become part of the ranch, the animals responding to her voice, the garden tidier than ever, the house filled with small touches of care and beauty she had added. Her presence was not only comforting, it was transformative. They began to plan small projects together, a new chicken coop, better storage for tools, and even a small garden for spring vegetables. James found himself looking forward to each day, anticipating the work they would do and the conversations they would share. Life, which had been routine and predictable, now held surprises and moments of joy. He realized that connection with another human being could be as vital as the food he grew or the animals he cared for. At night, after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, they would sit quietly, sharing thoughts that were too small or intimate for the day. Leona would sometimes recount a story from her childhood, a lesson learned, or a memory of her family. James would share his own reflections on the land, the years alone, and the beauty of the plains. These moments, simple yet profound, created a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. By the end of winter, James could hardly remember life before Leona arrived. The house had changed, the plains had changed, and he had changed. He had learned that solitude had its place, but so did companionship. He had discovered that sharing stories, work, and quiet moments could fill a life with meaning in a way that even the most peaceful solitude could not. As the snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown and green beneath, James realized that something deep and lasting had grown between him and Leona. It was a bond built not on romance alone, but on trust, respect, and the shared understanding of life in its simplest and truest forms. They had come to rely on each other, to find comfort in each other's presence, and to face the challenges of the plains together. And though neither of them could predict what the future would bring, both James and Leona knew that the ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a place of connection, warmth, and hope. For the first time in 10 winters, James felt that the house, the land, and even the harsh winter itself had become part of a life he no longer faced alone. Winter was slowly fading, though the plains still wore a blanket of snow that glittered in the sunlight. Inside the ranch, however, warmth had grown in a way that no stove or fire could provide. James and Leona had settled into a rhythm that made each day feel purposeful. Yet there was something more unfolding between them, a quiet closeness that neither had expected. They had started as strangers, then companions, and now something deeper was forming, a connection neither could ignore. Each morning began as usual, but James noticed subtle changes in himself. He found himself anticipating Leona's voice calling him to feed the animals, the sound of her boots crunching over the snow, and the warmth of her presence in the kitchen. Even in the stillness of early morning, he felt her absence when she wasn't nearby.
It was strange, almost unfamiliar, to feel this pull toward another person, but he welcomed it. For the first time in 10 winters, his solitude was no longer complete.
Leona had adapted to ranch life with ease, yet she brought new energy to it. She suggested small changes, such as moving the chicken's coop to a sunnier spot or reorganizing the storage room for better efficiency.
James listened to her ideas, appreciating not only her intelligence but also her respect for the land and the animals.
They worked side by side, repairing fences, clearing snow from the barn, and hauling firewood from the surrounding trees. Their laughter echoed in the quiet plains, breaking the monotony of long winters and filling the house with a warmth that went beyond the fire. As they worked together, they shared stories in a way that felt natural and effortless. Leona told James about the Navajo tradition she had grown up with, the sacred stories of her people, and the importance of passing these lessons to younger generations. She spoke about the connection to the land, the respect for nature, and the value of community. James, in turn, shared the history of his family, the reasons he had chosen life on the plains, and the quiet joys of tending to the ranch alone. Their stories intertwined, forming a bridge between two very different worlds. There were moments when silence spoke more than words. During long walks across the snow-covered fields, they would move side by side without speaking, simply observing the world around them. A hawk circling high above, tracks of deer in the fresh snow, or the soft whistle of the wind became a shared language. James realized that Leona had a way of noticing things he had taken for granted, and through her eyes he saw the ranch in a new light. The land felt alive in ways he had never fully appreciated, and he felt grateful for her perspective. Evenings were filled with quiet intimacy, not of romance alone, but of deep connection. They would sit by the fire after chores, sharing tea or a simple meal. Leona would hum softly as she mended clothes or read aloud from a small book she had brought, while James listened, letting the sound of her voice fill the spaces that had once been empty. Sometimes they shared memories, dreams, and fears, opening their hearts in ways they hadn't with anyone else. These moments created trust, a foundation stronger than either had expected. One afternoon, a heavy snowstorm forced them to stay indoors. The wind rattled the windows and snowdrifts piled against the porch. They worked together to reinforce the doors and clear the walkways, moving as a team with unspoken understanding. Afterward, they settled near the fire, exhausted but satisfied. James noticed the way Leona's eyes sparkled when she smiled, the warmth of her hand as she adjusted the fire, and the calm confidence she exuded in the face of challenges. He felt drawn to her in a way that went beyond friendship, yet it was more than attraction. It was admiration, trust, and comfort all in one. Leona noticed changes in James as well. He was less guarded, more open with his thoughts and lighter in his laughter. She saw the man who had chosen solitude out of necessity now learning to embrace connection. He shared stories he had kept to himself for years, memories of childhood, and the quiet regrets that had haunted him. She listened without judgment, offering empathy and understanding, and in doing so strengthened the bond between them. Together, they created a safe space where honesty and vulnerability could exist. Their companionship extended beyond practical matters. They discovered shared interests and joys, simple pleasures that brought light to the long winter days. On a rare sunny afternoon, they explored the nearby hills, examining animal tracks in the snow and identifying plants beneath the frost. Leona taught James to recognize patterns in the land he had walked for years, while James shared techniques for riding horses and caring for the animals. Their days became a balance of work, learning, and shared experiences, each moment reinforcing their connection. James began to notice the small ways in which Leona had changed the ranch. The animals responded to her with ease, the house was tidier and more welcoming, and the atmosphere felt lighter and happier. He realized that her presence had brought life back to the ranch, and he felt a gratitude deeper than he could express. The once lonely home had become a place of laughter, shared effort, and warmth. One evening, after the chores were done and the fire burned low, Leona asked James about his dreams he had never shared with anyone. He spoke quietly of hopes he had long set aside, ambitions for the ranch, and the simple desire for companionship. She listened attentively, nodding, her eyes reflecting understanding and encouragement. James realized that for the first time in years, someone truly cared about his thoughts and feelings. Her support gave him a sense of hope he had almost forgotten. Their bond deepened further as they faced challenges together. A sudden blizzard trapped them indoors for several days, and they relied on each other to maintain the house and care for the animals. Working together under pressure created trust, and each small success strengthened the relationship. They celebrated each accomplishment quietly, whether it was rescuing a stuck horse or mending a broken fence, recognizing that their combined effort made life easier and safer. Leona also helped James confront the emotional walls he had built over the years. She asked gentle questions about his past, encouraged him to reflect on regrets, and celebrated his victories no matter how small. He began to understand that sharing his life with someone did not diminish his independence. Rather, it added richness and meaning. Through her patience and understanding, James discovered that vulnerability could coexist with strength, and that the connections formed in trust were some of the most valuable in life. As the days passed, the house became a place of comfort, laughter, and shared purpose. James found himself looking forward to each morning, anticipating Leona's presence, her stories, and the shared labor that made even the hardest tasks enjoyable. Their companionship had transformed the ranch from a place of solitude to a home filled with warmth, mutual respect, and emotional connection. Winter slowly gave way to early signs of spring, the snow melting in patches to reveal the first hints of green. Yet the warmth they had created inside the house remained, independent of the weather. James realized that he no longer feared loneliness, because he had learned the value of connection and trust. He understood that life could be shared without losing independence, that companionship could enhance rather than diminish the simple pleasures he had found in solitude. By the end of this long season, James and Leona had become more than friends. Their bond was built on shared experience, mutual respect, and deep understanding. They had laughed, worked, learned, and faced challenges together, discovering strengths and joys they had not anticipated. James recognized that his life had been enriched in ways he could never have predicted, all because a single knock on the door had brought someone extraordinary into his world. And though neither of them could foresee the future, both James and Leona knew that they had found something rare, a partnership rooted in trust, care, and a deep emotional connection. The plains, once cold and empty, now felt alive. The ranch, once a solitary refuge, had become a place of companionship, warmth, and hope. They had built something together that neither could have imagined, a bond that would carry them through the coming seasons, whatever challenges they might face. Spring was slowly returning to the plains. The snow, which had covered the land for months, began to melt, revealing patches of green grass and the first signs of life after the long, harsh winter. The air was crisp, but warmer than it had been in months, carrying the scent of wet earth and early blooms. James noticed the subtle changes around the ranch, the soft rustle of the wind through budding trees, the sound of running water from streams freed of ice, and the lively movements of the animals as they adjusted to the changing season. Life was awakening again, and with it, James felt a shift inside himself too. Leona had stayed at the ranch through the winter longer than anyone might have expected. The car she had relied on for travel remained unfixed, and both of them had settled into a new rhythm of work, conversation, and quiet companionship. But now, as the snow receded and roads became passable again, the question of her departure lingered in the air. James had learned over the past months that he could not imagine the ranch without her presence, the warmth she brought, the laughter that echoed through the house, and the calm strength that had become a steady anchor in his life. One morning, as the sun peeked over the hills, James stood outside with Leona, observing the land they had tended together. The fences were repaired, the barn was organized, and the animals thrived. Everything bore the mark of their shared labor. James realized how much of his life she had touched, not just through work but through companionship.
Her presence had made the ranch feel complete in a way he had never known it could.
James, Leona said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. I should probably think about heading back home. My family will be expecting me. She hesitated, looking down at her boots, and then back up at him with a small, uncertain smile. James felt a knot tighten in his chest. I understand, he said, keeping his voice calm, though inside he felt restless. But I don't want you to go. Not yet. The ranch. It's different with you here. I can't imagine it without you. Leona's eyes softened, and she reached out, lightly touching his arm.
I feel the same way, James. This place, these months with you.
It's been unlike anything I've ever experienced. I didn't expect to find so much
Connection in the middle of nowhere. They stood together for a moment, watching the sunrise spread golden light over the plains. There was a quiet understanding between them. Neither had rushed into words before. Their bond had grown slowly, naturally, through shared work, conversation, and the small gestures that had become meaningful over time. Now, the truth of their feelings was undeniable. James finally spoke.
You don't have to leave. You can stay.
Not just for a little while. Stay here with me, on the ranch. We can figure it out together. Leona looked around at the house, the barn, the land. She thought of the long hours they had spent together, the stories they had shared, and the quiet comfort that had grown between them. She realized that she did not want to leave, not when she had found a place where she truly belonged. She smiled and nodded.
I'll stay, she said simply. I want to stay.
Relief washed over James, mingled with joy and a sense of hope he had not felt in years. The decision was simple, yet it carried the weight of months of trust, companionship, and growing affection. Together they would face the seasons ahead, no longer as strangers, not merely as companions, but as partners in life and in work. The days that followed were filled with renewed energy and plans for the future. They worked together to prepare the land for spring planting, cleaning and organizing the barn, tending to the animals, and making improvements to the house. James taught Leona more about the nuances of ranch life, and she shared ideas for better organization, animal care, and gardening techniques. Their shared efforts strengthened their bond even more, creating a sense of unity and purpose that went beyond mere friendship. Evenings became times of reflection and joy. They would sit by the fire after a long day, sharing stories, planning the next day, or simply enjoying each other's presence. James found himself laughing more freely, feeling lighter than he had in years. Leona's calm and thoughtful nature had brought balance to his life, and he realized that he had come to rely on her wisdom and perspective as much as her company. They also began to create new traditions together. On Sunday mornings, they would walk through the fields, checking the animals and sharing small talks about the future. They celebrated the first shoots of spring in the garden, noting which vegetables would grow best and planning for harvest. They even spent quiet evenings reading aloud, sometimes sharing stories from their respective childhoods or reading poems that spoke of the land and seasons. Life had become richer, layered with shared experiences, laughter, and mutual care. James reflected often on how different his life had become since the knock on the door. He had expected winter to be long and silent, yet it had brought him the most unexpected gift of companionship. Leona's presence had not only changed his daily routine, but had transformed the way he viewed the world. He had learned that solitude had its place, but connection had the power to bring life, warmth, and meaning in ways he could never have imagined alone. Leona, too, saw the change in James. The man who had once seemed distant and self-contained now smiled more openly, laughed freely, and shared his thoughts without hesitation. She admired his strength, his deep knowledge of the land, and the patience with which he approached every task. But beyond admiration, she felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. The ranch, the plains, and even the challenges of winter had become part of a shared story, a life built together. As spring continued, the ranch began to flourish. New grass sprouted, the animals were healthier, and the house felt vibrant with life. James and Leona planted a garden together, marking each row carefully and tending the soil with care. They celebrated the first sprouts with small rituals, watering, marking the rows, and planning future harvests. Each success, however small, was shared joy, reinforcing their bond and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Neighbors who had once seen James as a solitary figure began to notice the change as well. They observed Leona's presence, the laughter that carried across the fields, and the way the ranch seemed more alive than ever. Some would stop by occasionally, offering greetings and small gifts, but it was clear to everyone that the heart of the ranch had shifted. James was no longer alone, and the land reflected the joy and care that two people had poured into it. One quiet evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and pink, James and Leona stood on the porch looking over the plains. The sky was vast, and the wind carried the scent of fresh earth and early blooms. James felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling he had not known in years. He realized that life, with its unexpected turns, could bring happiness in the most unlikely ways. A single knock on the door had changed everything, and he knew that the bond he shared with Leona was something rare and precious. Leona turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "A winter that felt so long and cold has given me something I didn't know I was missing." James smiled, taking her hand gently in his. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm glad it happened. I'm glad you knocked on my door." Together they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the plains stretching endlessly before them. It was a moment of quiet triumph, not of grand achievement, but of life shared, trust built, and love found in the simplest ways. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a home filled with warmth, laughter, and hope. They had faced winters, storms, and long days together, and now they looked forward to the seasons ahead, knowing that whatever came, they would face it side by side. In the days that followed, they continued their work, their laughter echoing across the plains. The animals thrived, the garden grew, and the house became a symbol of the life they were building together. Every task, every shared meal, every quiet moment by the fire reinforced their bond. They had learned that life was not meant to be endured alone, and that the simplest acts of care and companionship could create a future brighter than anything they had imagined. As spring fully arrived, the ranch seemed to awaken along with the land. Birds returned, flowers began to bloom, and the streams flowed freely once more. James and Leona planted new crops, repaired fences, and prepared for the months ahead, confident in their partnership and the life they were creating. The plains, once cold and lonely, now carried the warmth of connection, trust, and shared dreams. And so, after 10 winters of solitude, James's life had transformed completely. The ranch, which had been a refuge for a solitary man, had become a home for two people united by respect, trust, and love. Leona's knock on the door had been the beginning of something extraordinary. A journey from isolation to companionship, from silence to laughter, from loneliness to hope. Together, they faced the future, ready for every season, every challenge, and every joy, knowing that the bond they had formed would carry them through whatever lay ahead.